Hello everyone and welcome back to Bitwig Studio and Music Production. This is lesson 5.34, and in this lesson we're going to start to talk about analog distortion. I'll quickly mention the different types of analog distortion that you'll probably come across, and we'll take a look at Bitwig's own plugin device that tries to emulate this particular effect that's going to be adding harmonics into our frequency spectrum, even if we're just starting with something like a sine wave. And we can see I already have a distortion on here. Let's delete that. Let's listen to our sine wave. Sounds good to me, nice and siney. So I talked about in the last video how if you breach your threshold, if you breach that zero, whether in the analog domain or the digital domain, by however much you breach the threshold, that needs to be redistributed back into the signal in some way. With digital distortion, it's really gritty, it's really grimy, and there's not a whole lot of logic to where we're going to start to see these overtones and these peaks, and they're not going to be very musical. So if we play up and down the keyboard with a patch, it's not always going to follow along like we'd want it to, at least in terms of true digital distortion when we're going into the reds. In the analog domain, something else entirely happens. When we breach by, say, 10 decibels, that 10 decibels gets redistributed, and it's going to be redistributed in a very musical and consonant way, dating all the way back to some of the stuff we talked about in the early videos on harmonics and how sound works, how sound is distributed. And it's really quite a beautiful and lovely thing. And so the first time we looked at the distortion device, we were really just focused on listening and not really looking. Now we're going to be talking about looking, and we'll have our span device open so we can see where exactly these harmonics are being added, and you'll get the chance to see how harmonically pleasing these really are. Remember that when you're doing this yourself, it's probably going to be on more complex patches than a sine wave. So this is being used just so you can see where the harmonics are going to be hyped. So in your own patches, you'll know how you might want to filter that and get something to sound nice. So the Bitwig distortion, in my opinion, is really modeled after one of these old rectifier cabinet type guitar amps. And you can see that we have some controls here on the box, and in the back we have tubes. Okay, and that brings us to our first kind of type of analog distortion. There's a type of analog distortion referred to as tube distortion, and with tube distortion what we have is both odd and even order harmonics being evoked, so something very similar to what we have with a sawtooth wave. Okay, it should all start to make sense now. We have another type which is referred to as solid state distortion. And with solid state distortion, we're only going to be hyping odd ordered harmonics, so like a triangle wave or like a square wave. And then there's also tape saturation and tape distortion, which we'll talk about a little bit later. The Bitwig distortion device is capable of both emulating a solid state circuit and emulating tube distortion based on how you set it up. So let's just set this thing up now. I'm going to pull the slew all the way up to 100. I'm going to pull the DC bias all the way down. I'm going to put the symmetry to 0. We have a pre-filter, not that it's going to do anything because we just have a sine wave. And we have a post filter, which I'm going to open all the way up so we can hear everything. Pull the drive way, way, way up. Pull the level way down. Pull the width way down. And pull the mix way down so we can start to factor this in. If you have any questions as to why I did that, feel free to leave that in the comments. So here we go. Let's get started with our just sine wave. And with symmetry at 0, let's hear what happens since we already have so much drive. To me, that looks awfully similar to what the basis of either a triangle wave or a square wave looks like. And as I continue to increase the mix, it's going to become more and more squarey. So how similar is that to a square wave? Well, you tell me. A little bit darker, a little bit more I don't know, has a little bit more of a distorted kind of edge to it. Also because our filter is pulled down, and so this distortion device is only able to focus in on that one fundamental frequency as compared to if we had something that was more squarey to begin with. That is going to make a huge, huge difference. Okay, so what does this symmetry knob control? Well, the symmetry knob is going to control the sort of character of this distortion device. So is it going to be more tubey? Is it going to be more solid state? Right now, it's like solid state. We're just seeing those odd harmonics. We're not really seeing any even harmonics, but as I even change this symmetry slightly, you're going to hear and see what happens. Just pull down my output. So this is a really characteristic kind of tubey sound. It's hyping not only the odd harmonics, but it's really hyping those even harmonics too. So we're getting a bit more of a buzzy kind of sound. And if you want, you can even go in here and look to see where all of these are falling. So the symmetry control is really, really important in sort of determining how much tube you want. And we have two different types. So if we go to the left, it's going to sound like maybe tube model B, and to the right, tube model A. So let's just listen to the variation. So somewhere in the middle, and I personally like it with the symmetry going to the left, might give us the best of both worlds. So still making that solid state connection, adding in just a bit of tube. Okay, very, very cool. Our other controls in here, these are also going to impact the frequency spectrum in some way. Our slew rate is really like a bandwidth control at the top end. Okay, so let's get some more high-end stuff going on in here. Let's start to pull back the slew rate and watch and see what happens. So what I want you to notice is that it's not actually changing any of the harmonics, their location. It's just choosing which ones it's going to hype and which ones it's not going to hype. So we can watch that here in like slow motion. And so this can really give us even more interesting characteristics to our distortion. This might be a fun one to kind of like automate really, really slowly with an LFO. Definitely don't want too much. Put on retrigger. Let's give it some more depth. And so that's a pretty cool sound that you can get if you ever are interested in messing around with that. We also have our DC bias. The DC bias, I don't really know the engineering behind it, but I do know that it will actually kind of evoke let's see, I'm going to turn this back to solid state. It's going to give us the even order harmonics, only it's going to like reverse the intensity, and you'll see what I mean here. I'm gonna have to crank the drive up more. Okay, so let me start with the DC bias here and watch where these first harmonics start to pop up with the DC bias. So you can see that we're adding in harmonics just like in the reverse order of what we'd expect. So instead of the slope going like this, like we'd see with a sawtooth wave, it's exactly the opposite. The slope goes up like that, which is really kind of a very interesting and can just add you even more variety to your sounds like that. Okay, so let's dial something in here that we're happy with. Thought I said clear. Obviously, we actually have an additional filter to help us out here if things are getting out of control. And notice how I play up the keyboard? It's just going to follow right along. Very musical. The one thing to watch out for with any kind of distortion, analog distortion in particular, is that because we're typically hyping frequencies more closer to our fundamental, if we start to play chords, even if we play very logical chords, it sometimes can get way, way too dirty. So I'm going to take this out of monophonic mode, and I'm just going to play like a C triad. And because these are pretty spaced close together, it's going to sound really grimy. So that sounds pretty cool, but not something that's going to be super usable. But instead, if I play, I'm using my computer keyboard, so let's see, C, D, E, F, G. If I play something like that, it sounds really nice because I'm utilizing that perfect fifth. But if I play something that's just like one tone apart, we're going to have some problems recreating that, and we're going to get some nasty beating. And obviously, we can play around with some of the other harmonic relationships. Perfect fourth, perfect fifth. There's that seventh. And then the octave is going to sound really clean. You can barely even hear that any distortion is taking place there. All right, so that was our first video on analog distortion. In the next few videos, we're going to investigate a few other devices that specifically try to emulate certain types of distortion. Thank you so much for watching, and you'll hear from me again in the next lesson. Take care.